Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the stone-echoed silence of a medieval convent. It's just before dawn. The cold is thin but biting, the kind that clings to wool and wakes you better than any bell. You shuffle down a narrow cloister, candle in hand, the flames sputtering as your slippered feet trace the same limestone grooves walked by centuries of women before you. This isn't the glamorous kind of history. This is the scratchy, solemn, slightly mildewed kind. Welcome to monastic life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not exactly bursting with options if you're a well-born girl in 12th century Europe. Too smart? Cloister. Too poor for a dowry? Cloister. Too outspoken at the dinner table? You guessed it. The convent doors open wide for anyone deemed unsuitable for the outside world, but inside, life isn't exactly a Renaissance painting. Your cell is barely wide enough to stretch in. The bedding is straw, the blankets coarse. You wash with cold water from a wooden basin and scrape your scalp clean with lye. You spend your days in prayer, in study, in chores, always in silence unless you're reciting scripture or asking for forgiveness. But here's the twist. Even within these cold stone walls, something strangely human wriggles its way through. Something warm, messy, creative. Desire, but not always the kind you expect. Historians still argue whether it was repression or divine inspiration, but some nuns, yes, actual nuns, began to write poetry. Not just psalms and penitential verses, but lines laced with longing, metaphors of heat and hunger, whispered devotions that sometimes sound suspiciously earthy. Take a deep breath. The air is heavy with incense and old ink. You can almost hear the scratching of quills down the hall. A sister's candle stays lit longer than allowed. She's writing again. Not a letter. Not a sermon. Something else. It's easy to assume medieval convents were little prisons, but they were also centers of literacy. And for women barred from pulpits and politics, the pen became a kind of secret key. You wouldn't survive modern dorm life without a phone. Here, the quill is your only outlet. A mainstream fact most forget, many convents had libraries that rivaled small universities. Some were copied by hand right there in the scriptorium. Which means Sister Agnes isn't just praying all day, she's reading. And rereading. And somewhere between Augustine's Confessions and Hildegard's Visions, her mind drifts. You pass her by, eyes lowered, as she slips a folded parchment into her sleeve. That poem isn't for public chanting. It might never be shared. Or maybe if she's clever, she'll weave it between lines of theological reflection, like slipping a love note between church hymns. One fringe detail? Some of these poetic fragments were preserved not in religious anthologies but tucked into household books, miscatalogued for centuries. Historians only found them because someone thought to check the blank margins of a sermon manuscript. Apparently, even divine instruction leaves room for a doodle or two. Back in your imagination, you settle into a wooden choir stall, one of many identical seats facing each other. Each nun cloaked in indigo or russet wool, hands hidden in sleeves, eyes lowered. A prayer begins. Latin syllables echo like waves. But you notice something. A slight smirk. A flicker of eye contact across the aisle. Not all prayer is pious. Some of it hides behind borrowed metaphors, gardens, rivers, fire. The Song of Songs from the Bible, for example, was practically the 50 Shades of Scripture. All allegory, of course. Allegory, with dimples. And it's not just whispers in the cloister. Some abbesses encouraged poetic writing, seeing it as a path to deeper contemplation. Others turned a blind eye. After all, if the content passed through enough Latin and metaphor, who's to say what was spiritual and what was spicy? You wrap your robe tighter as you pass the chapel. A warm candle glow flickers behind the door. Someone's kneeling in vigil, but you sense she's not just praying. She's remembering, imagining. rewriting the world she can't touch. Because here's the reality check: you probably wouldn't survive this life. The routine alone would break you. The cold. The constant rules. The absence of music, except when it's liturgical and sung at 4 a.m. But the women who did live this life, they found ways to exist within it, fully, creatively, sometimes rebelliously. And so you move deeper into the convent, where sleep is a privilege, and imagination is a quiet act of resistance. A knock echoes from the gate. A delivery, perhaps. Or news from the outside. You'll never know. You're not allowed to answer. But someone just slipped a parchment into the warming shelf behind the fireplace. It smells faintly of rosewater and secrecy. You return to your cell, lay on the straw mattress, and listen to the wind against the shutters. Somewhere, quills are still moving. Not fast, not urgently, just persistently. Like thoughts that refuse to stay contained. You close your eyes. And in the dark, a phrase lingers, one you don't quite understand. Something about longing. Something about light. You wake again before the bell rings. The cold hasn't moved an inch, and neither have your joints. Every creak of your bones sounds like the groan of the wooden beams above you. Time inside a convent is slippery. You can't always tell if it's Thursday or Pentecost or just another long loop of prayer and porridge. But today feels off. There's a hum in the air. Or maybe it's just your imagination reaching for something new. You rise, fingers stiff, and make your way back to the scriptorium. It's the quiet heart of the abbey, a place of ink-stained fingers, brittle vellum, and near-constant whisper humming from the nun who sharpens quills a little too enthusiastically. It's also where some of the most peculiar things happen. You wouldn't guess it from the outside, but this room, lit by high windows and the occasional tallow candle, is a crucible of thoughts, fantasies, and dangerous little metaphors. And today, someone's left their parchment out. At first glance, it's a psalm. A standard call and response, the kind of thing you can recite with your eyes closed. But the Latin is strange. There's a slant to the rhythm, and some of the words aren't in the Vulgate. Ignis dulcissimus, sweet fire. Corpus uti hortus, a body like a garden. That's not standard devotional language. That's poetry. And not just poetry. It's personal. Sensual. A landscape of metaphors that make you shift in your woolen robes. You look around. No one else has noticed. Yet. A mainstream fact here. Many of the women in convents were highly educated. More so than most men outside the monastery walls. They read Latin fluently, sometimes Greek. They transcribed theology, copied legal texts, even annotated the margins with commentary. In a world that largely silenced women's voices, the convent made them scholars. But sometimes the margin notes drift. Sometimes Sister Clara doodles vines around her verses. Sometimes she pens a line of longing between lines of liturgy. No one knows whether it was intended as divine yearning or something more tactile. Historians still argue whether these were coded love poems to Christ, or thinly veiled yearnings for remembered affection, human or otherwise. You sit down at your spot on the long bench. Your inkwell has frozen again. You warm it in your palm, then dip your quill. You're supposed to be copying Gregory the Great, but your eyes wander to the abandoned poem. It reads, I felt his breath on my shoulder, yet saw no flame. Only the tremble of petals, where none had bloomed. You pause. The handwriting is neat, feminine, practiced. Not rushed. This wasn't a fleeting fancy. This was deliberate. And here's a fringe tidbit that's too good to leave out. One surviving 13th century manuscript includes a line so evocative that a modern historian blushed while translating it. Hidden in the folds of a hymn was a reference to a mouth upon the chalice of my soul. Scholars still debate if it's symbolic or, something else. You wonder who wrote it. Could have been anyone. Or several anyones. Many convents circulated texts among each other. One abbey would send a hymn book to another, and someone on the receiving end might tuck in their own verse like a pressed flower. There's a chance these poems weren't written in isolation but shared, secretly, reverently. An early form of literary flirtation? Maybe. Or just a quiet way to feel connected in a place where touch and conversation were limited to ritual. Your own stomach growls. Breakfast won't be served for hours. You focus on your manuscript again. But as you dip your quill, the rhythm of that poem pulses under your breath. It's not just about desire, it's about being seen, being known. The convent is full of mirrors, but not the reflective kind. Every prayer, every task, every rule is a mirror of holiness you're supposed to live up to. But these poems? These secret stanzas? They're cracked reflections. Human. Messy. Honest. You start to notice signs everywhere. Not overt, but there. The way Sister Madeline lingers over a certain song. The faded initials next to a lyric that doesn't match the rest. The way some verses bend around their subject like a vine around a trellis, hinting, never saying. You turn the page and find a scribe's note. Periculum in verbo. Danger in the word. That could mean anything. A theological warning. A reminder of human frailty. Or maybe just a sly acknowledgement. Yes, words are dangerous. That's why we write them. And here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't survive as a medieval scribe. Your back would rebel. Your eyesight would dissolve. The ink would stain your hands and never come out. But you'd understand the ache behind the words. The need to mark something down, even if no one ever reads it. The bell rings for lauds. You rise slowly, tucking your unfinished lines between the pages of your psalter. You chant the morning prayers with the others, lips moving in perfect time, but your mind is elsewhere. Back on that phrase, sweet fire. You wonder if it was metaphor. Or memory. The candle smoke curls toward the high stone ceiling, and somewhere behind you, Sister Clara sneezes and is glared at with holy ferocity. You bite back a smile. You're outside now, walking the narrow path between the herb garden and the orchard wall, your breath clouding gently in the dawn chill. The frost crunches softly underfoot, and the world smells like damp wool, rosemary, and the faintest trace of ash from the kitchens. The convent is quiet again after morning prayers, but this kind of silence isn't empty, it's layered. You hear the scratching of a rake, the low mutter of a nun cursing a particularly stubborn weed, the distant coo of pigeons roosting under the eaves. There's a rhythm to it all. Even the wind knows to keep its voice down. You pause at the edge of the garden where a rough stone bench waits beneath a pear tree that never quite fruits properly. This is your moment of unofficial peace, the tiny gap between duties. The hour when no one is asking you to clean the sacristy or rebind a worn-out psalter. You reach into your sleeve and pull out the folded bit of vellum you tucked away earlier. The one with the poem. You read it again. This time, slower. Letting each syllable roll around like warm honey. He comes with silence, bearing wine in his gaze, and I, the unworthy chalice, tremble to be filled. It's not subtle, but it's beautiful. And this brings us to something crucial. How you read it matters. Because in the medieval mind, metaphor was a gateway, not a disguise. People didn't necessarily separate the spiritual from the sensual the way we try to now. A kiss could be symbolic. A sigh could mean devotion. Or it could mean desire. Or both. Historians still argue whether these kinds of texts were purely theological exercises in mystical love, or personal expressions bursting through spiritual metaphors like roots cracking through stone. One fact that's often forgotten: nuns weren't cut off from literature. Far from it. Many convents had libraries, some quite large, and not every book was a treatise on the Trinity. There were saints' visions, yes, but also tales of courtly love, chivalric quests, even poems penned by women long before them, women like Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, who wrote dramas with female leads long before Shakespeare ever inked a quill. But back to you, and your thumb stroking the edge of that vellum. You're not supposed to keep it. Technically, anything left out should be returned to the abbess or the scriptorium master. But something in you hesitates. Not out of rebellion, but empathy. Whoever wrote this wanted to be heard. Even if just for a moment. Even if just by someone like you, sitting on a cold bench beneath a fruitless tree. And then, footsteps. You fold the vellum quickly and slip it beneath the edge of your habit. Sister Agnes appears around the corner, holding a basket of leeks and looking mildly inconvenienced by their existence. She nods at you, unsmiling, then continues toward the kitchens. You wait until the sound of her footfalls fades, then breathe again. Here's a quirky tidbit you might enjoy. Some nuns were known to speak in riddles. Not just for fun, but as a kind of intellectual play, a safe way to explore themes that weren't always doctrinally encouraged. One manuscript includes what appears to be a riddle about a candle that may or may not be a metaphor for a secret lover. The text was copied and recopied across abbeys, each scribe adding tiny flourishes, an extra curve here, a strange Latin pun there. Almost like an inside joke passed down for decades. You return to your cell, closing the door gently behind you. The room is bare, a small cot, a single wooden cross above it, a thin blanket that never quite stops shivering. You sit. You think. And then you pull out your own sheet of vellum. You're not a poet. You've never dared to be. But now, the desire to answer, to speak, thrums in your chest. You grind a bit of leftover charcoal and mix it with water. Not ideal ink, but it will do. Your fingers hesitate. What if someone reads this? What if no one does? You begin anyway. I wake as if kissed by a thought not my own. A breath before meaning. A heat in the stone. You stare at it. It's not great. But it's yours. Something inside you has unfurled, like the first page of a book no one ever expected you to write. And here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't survive monastic discipline for more than a few days. The fasting. The silence. The bells. The unrelenting proximity to people who chew with their mouths closed and pray with their mouths open. But you'd recognize this, the need to reach through the rules with words. To connect. To create. The bell rings for manual labor. You set down the sheet, careful to place your psalter on top. No one needs to know yet. Not unless you decide otherwise. Out in the yard, the world resumes its clumsy spinning. Chickens run underfoot, and someone's complaining about the state of the laundry pail. But you, walking slowly toward your assigned chore, carry something secret now. Something worth folding into the margin. You're still deep in the echoing halls of the convent. Only now you've stumbled into a side corridor not listed on the official floor plan. It's colder here, quieter too, and the candles seem to flicker with a knowing kind of mischief. Something about the walls feels different, as if they've heard more than just prayers. This is where things get interesting. Because behind those thick wooden doors and under those layers of wool and linen, some nuns were doing more than just illuminating manuscripts with gold leaf and vines. They were writing poems. Erotic ones. Yes, really. Not lewd scrolls or salacious parchments passed under cloaks, but delicate, artfully composed verses full of yearning, spiritual ache, and, let's say, sensuous metaphors that would make a bishop choke on his incense. You're probably wondering, wait, weren't these women supposed to be cloistered, silent, and married to God? Technically, yes. But the human brain doesn't become less creative just because it's behind a grill. In fact, constraint often sharpens imagination, and for some women locked away in sacred spaces, language became the only outlet that could stretch far enough to hold desire, devotion, frustration, and identity at once. The poems range from the subtly tender to the breathtakingly blunt. In one, a nun describes her longing for the Virgin Mary in language so rich with physicality, you're left wondering where mysticism ends and metaphor begins. In another, an anonymous voice writes of her body like a field longing to be sown. And no, she doesn't mean that agriculturally. One famous figure in this clandestine world is Heloise. Yes, that Heloise, of Abelard and Heloise fame. While her letters aren't poems, they toe the same line between spiritual transcendence and painfully human longing. She's brilliant, self-aware, and burning with a passion that no vow of chastity could fully contain. In one letter, she essentially says, "Sure, I'm married to God now, but I still dream about the nights with you, Abelard." And by the way, spiritual purity doesn't erase memory. Historians still argue whether these texts were purely symbolic, acts of spiritual devotion couched in the language of longing, or if they reveal real, often repressed, desires. Was this coded eroticism or actual experience breaking through the cracks in convent walls? The answer is probably both. What makes this even stranger is that many of these texts weren't hidden or destroyed. They were copied and recopied, often by other nuns. Not because they were rebellious, but because they understood. These writings spoke to the full range of human feeling, and devotion didn't have to be sexless to be sacred. Unless you think this was a fringe behavior, think again. Across medieval Europe, convents served as unexpected pockets of literary freedom. Women could write, teach, and yes, even express love in ways that would have been scandalous outside those cloistered walls. Some scholars now call convents gendered laboratories of the written word, which is both accurate and sounds like something from a steampunk novella. You walk past the desk where a quill rests beside an open folio. The ink is still wet. A few lines have been crossed out and rewritten in smaller, more delicate script. The parchment smells faintly of rosemary and beeswax. Maybe this one was meant for someone specific. Maybe it never made it past this room. But it exists. And that's enough to change how you think about what holy really meant here. One fringe tidbit? Some poems were written in acrostic form, where the first letter of each line spells out a secret name. Scholars have decoded a few that spell out feminine names not found in any saint's registry. Whether these were real lovers, muses, or imagined companions, we don't know. But the intent is clear. Love, desire, and spirituality were not separate categories. They were intertwined, like the ivy inked onto the margins of their manuscripts. And here's your gentle reminder: none of this means the convent was a pleasure palace or a secret poetry salon. Life was still tough, cold, monotonous, and often lonely. But within that hardship, these women carved out emotional sanctuaries using the only tools available: words, parchment, and imagination. You pause to admire the script. It's not rushed. Each stroke of the pen seems chosen, deliberate, soft. The parchment crinkles slightly as you lean closer. There's power here, not loud, but pulsing just below the surface. So, if you thought all medieval nuns spent their lives quietly praying and making soup, well, you probably wouldn't survive this literary salon either. Not without getting very flustered and spilling the holy water. You've wandered farther now, past the cloisters and into what might once have been a scriptorium. The light here is gentle, amber through narrow leaded windows, just enough to illuminate the long wooden desks. In the far corner, a sister is bent over a page, her breath shallow with concentration. Her veil droops slightly, forgotten as her quill dances. This is the heart of the literary convent. Before you say it, yes, nuns wrote a lot. And not just erotically tinged poetry either. They composed treatises, histories, plays, letters, and entire spiritual autobiographies. One of the earliest known female-authored books in English? Penned by a nun. Shout out to Julian of Norwich, who literally described her entire mystic revelation as a showing, because why not market a divine vision like a Netflix original? But for every Julian, there were dozens of lesser-known women scribbling quietly, intentionally, in the margins of male-dominated discourse. And some, like the nuns of the convent at Helfta in 13th century Germany, became literary powerhouses. Think of Helfta as the medieval version of an all-girls writing retreat, but with less red wine and more Gregorian chant. There, women like Mechthild of Magdeburg poured out spiritual experiences in a style that was ecstatic, visceral, and sometimes so sensual that later editors tried to tidy up the translations. One passage from Mechthild describes God entering her soul like warm light in a locked room, her breath catching, her body trembling. It's devotional, sure, but it also reads like a scene from a romance novel if you squint. And yes, historians still argue whether this mysticism was a socially acceptable outlet for unspoken desires, or a sincere spiritual transcendence untainted by anything earthly. The truth, inconveniently, is likely both. Remember, women in cloisters didn't choose between being rational scribes or swooning mystics. They were both. Some days, you're translating Augustine's Confessions. Other days, you're writing about how the Holy Spirit made you feel like a bride of the fire. Same hands, same ink. It's easy to assume these women lived small lives, but their minds roamed far beyond convent walls. They read widely, when they could, copied texts meticulously, and often corresponded with scholars, theologians, and sometimes even kings. Marjorie Kemp, who definitely deserves her own reality show, dictated the first known autobiography in English. She claimed to cry so often and so dramatically in church that she once made a priest move pews just to escape her. Fringe tidbit? Some convents even had their own internal libraries with carefully catalogued sections. Fictional saints, healing remedies, romance-adjacent visions. If it was written, someone tucked it into a shelf. And no, not all of it was church-approved. A few cheeky nuns slipped Arthurian tales between psalters. Because when you're stuck on night watch in a freezing chapel, who wouldn't want to sneak in a bit of Lancelot? You linger near the shelves. The scent of old vellum is oddly soothing, like powdered milk and pressed flowers. Each book here was handmade, letter by letter, stitch by stitch. And while you're standing there imagining quill strokes and cramped fingers, it hits you, they weren't writing to be remembered. They were writing to survive, to think through their faith, to keep their minds sharp, to find beauty inside enclosure, and sometimes, yes, to confess feelings they had nowhere else to place. Even the margins of manuscripts became playgrounds for subtext. Scholars have found tiny doodles, rabbits jousting, women chasing men, nuns wielding swords. Maybe it was whimsy. Maybe it was code. Either way, it's evidence that these women had interior lives that refused to stay tidy and reverent. And sometimes, they inserted marginalia that read more like diary entries than decoration. One exhausted scribe scrawled in the corner, "Oh, my hand!" Another added, "This parchment is rough. The ink is bad. I am very cold." You nod. You've sent text messages with worse moods. At the edge of the scriptorium, a window looks out over a small garden. You can just make out a figure stooping among the herbs, maybe reciting lines to herself. Basil for focus. Lavender for calm. Rosemary for memory. This was their rhythm: write, pray, tend, write again. So no, not every nun was whispering poems about longing into the darkness. But many were writing something, and that something had value, even when no one was reading. Which is kind of the whole point of this journey. These weren't just good girls locked away from the world. They were thinkers, creators, sometimes heretics, occasionally romantics. Always more than footnotes. You watch the quill still moving at the desk across the room, as steady as a heartbeat. Outside, a bell tolls. The bell's echo fades, and you find yourself drifting toward another part of the convent. The infirmary, maybe, or a quiet cell meant for contemplation. It's smaller here, the ceilings lower, the candlelight softer. You can almost feel the breath of centuries exhaled into these walls. And in the hush, you begin to sense something deeper. Not just words. Desire. Not loud or wild, but warm, quiet, and complicated. Let's say this plainly. Some medieval nuns wrote erotic poetry. You're probably picturing something scandalous now. But hold on. This isn't modern erotica with Fabio on the cover. Think layered metaphor, slow-burning symbolism, and an uncanny ability to blur the lines between spiritual ecstasy and physical longing. It's like reading love letters to the divine, only the divine sometimes feels suspiciously like a crush. Take Beatrice of Nazareth, a 13th century nun from the Low Countries. Her most famous work, The 7 Manners of Love, describes the soul's yearning for God in such vivid, embodied terms that it makes you shift in your imaginary seat. She writes of a love that enters the body, melts the soul, pierces the heart. At one point, she describes the soul, swooning sweetly, in God's presence. Honestly? It's not far off from a slow-motion romantic montage set to cello music. And historians still argue whether she was simply following the popular mystical style of the time, or if she was expressing something deeply personal, maybe even sublimated emotion she couldn't voice aloud. Because here's the rub, nuns were human. And humanity comes with feelings. Some of those feelings were about God. Some of them weren't. Now let's dip into the quirky fringe. One anonymous poem from a 14th century German convent describes Jesus as a knight who rides the heart of the speaker. The imagery flirts openly with courtly romance traditions, sword, armor, pursuit, but filters them through a spiritual lens. The result? A devotional poem that's also, let's call it suggestive. And sometimes the line between secular and sacred was razor thin. Hildegard of Bingen, visionary, composer, abbess, once described the Virgin Mary as a glowing gateway of divine pleasure. Yep. Gateway. Pleasure. Did we mention Hildegard was later canonized? Just saying. It wasn't just about metaphor either. Some texts preserved from women's religious communities hint at same-sex affection couched in spiritual language. Letters between certain nuns speak of longing, touches, kisses exchanged in Christ. Now, modern scholars are careful not to anachronize these texts. Not every tender phrase is romantic. But some feel just a bit too warm to be entirely platonic. And remember, these weren't isolated flukes. They were part of a broader culture of devotional intensity, where love of God was meant to consume you entirely. Visions were physical. Ecstasies were full body. And poetry? Poetry was the only place to put all those feelings. By now, you're probably wondering, were they aware of what they were doing? Here's the unsettling answer. Possibly yes. Possibly no. Medieval spirituality embraced paradox. You could write about being ravished by divine fire and still be considered chaste. In fact, the more intensely you desired God, the holier you appeared. Desire, in this context, wasn't sinful, it was aspirational. The trick was making sure it was directed heavenward. Still, human emotions leak. When you live behind stone walls, with few outlets, a sharp mind, and an even sharper quill, it's no surprise if a little longing slips into your lyrics. Think of these poems as emotional venting disguised as theology. And don't forget the performance aspect. A well-crafted poem could elevate a nun's reputation within the community. It showed literacy, eloquence, piety. Bonus points if it made someone cry during evening prayer. At the same time, these women weren't just playing with fire. They were navigating a spiritual tightrope. One wrong metaphor, one too earthy description of divine union, and you risked correction, or worse, suspicion of heresy. But they did it anyway. Because writing was power. And even within enclosure, even bound by vows, they found space to shape their inner worlds. Some of those worlds were radiant and clean. Others? A little messy. A little human. You pause in the narrow hall. There's a small alcove where a few candle stubs drip wax into iron holders. Maybe this was where a sister knelt to copy lines in secret. Maybe she drafted her verses in her mind first, whispering them between prayers. Maybe she dared to let her yearning slip into syllables, hoping no one would notice the heat behind her words. And even if no one ever read them, or even if someone scraped them off the parchment to reuse the vellum, those feelings mattered. They were real. They left traces. And they brought us closer to understanding just how richly textured the lives of cloistered women could be. Because the truth is, these nuns weren't angels. They were poets. And poets feel things, intensely, inconveniently, sometimes in iambic pentameter. Somewhere nearby, water drips into a stone basin. The sound echoes, soft and steady, like punctuation in this long conversation with the past. You take another careful step, your fingers brushing the cool plaster of the convent wall, and just like that, you're in the refectory. Long wooden benches. A narrow window. And inexplicably, a carved pelican feeding its young with its own blood perched above the door. Medieval metaphors, am I right? Here's where things get stranger, and more tangled. You see, writing erotic poetry, even if metaphorical, was one thing. But performing piety with a kind of sensual intensity? That was practically fashionable. Let's talk about embodied devotion. You've already glimpsed some of this. Nuns who described their spiritual lives in lavish, sensory terms. But it went deeper than poetry. These women lived their faith physically. Some took their longing for the divine so seriously they reenacted Christ's suffering in their own bodies. We're talking voluntary fasting, sleeping on planks, wearing hair shirts under their habits. Catherine of Siena allegedly lived on nothing but the Eucharist and once licked a leper's wound to demonstrate humility. And you thought your last juice cleanse was intense. Historians still argue whether these acts were forms of spiritual discipline or cries for autonomy in lives that allowed little control. Either way, they made a statement. I am feeling this. Deeply. And the Church didn't always object. In fact, this physical mysticism was often encouraged, when it came from the right women. Pious suffering became a kind of spiritual theater, one that sometimes earned women sainthood. Just be sure to aim your passion upward. The line between sanctity and scandal was real, and easy to cross. Speaking of blurred lines, let's dive into a fringe tidbit. Margaretha Ebner, a 14th century Dominican nun, kept a diary of her dreams and spiritual experiences. In one, she claimed baby Jesus appeared to her, nestled into her arms, and called her his little darling. The tone? Oddly maternal and romantic at once. Another nun, Agnes Blambican, described experiencing the wound of Christ's side opening up to her during communion, so vividly that she claimed to taste it. Taste it. And you're left wondering, were these visions genuine expressions of divine intimacy, or symptoms of spiritual isolation, intensified by repetition and belief? Either way, they were written down, preserved, cherished. In convent life, the body was both vessel and battleground. You weren't supposed to think too much about it. Yet everything you did, kneeling, fasting, praying, writing, passed through it. No wonder the lines blurred. And for women cut off from worldly experience, the divine was often imagined through the only available template, their own senses. Now picture this. The sister across the table from you tonight, spooning barley stew in silence, might have spent the morning in ecstatic prayer. She might be planning to rise at 2 a.m. to kneel until sunrise. She might also, quietly, be composing verses in her head about how God's mercy rushes over her like warm rain, or how His love wounds her more sweetly than any earthly touch. It's both devotional and dangerous. And entirely hers. Remember, most nuns didn't choose this life as a romantic retreat. Some entered as young as 7. Some were promised to the Church by ambitious families looking to avoid dowries. Others fled there for safety, or lack of options. But once inside, many discovered something unexpected: room to think, to create, to love in a way that made sense to them, even if it raised eyebrows. And when love couldn't be named plainly, it got wrapped in incense and Latin. Don't misunderstand. These women weren't sneaking around the rules so much as stretching them. Pushing at the edges of what acceptable piety looked like. They built rich inner landscapes, where longing and holiness intertwined like vines. They didn't write erotic poetry in rebellion. They wrote because they had to find words for something bigger than themselves. And sometimes those words came dressed in silk metaphors, trembling vowels, breathless enjambments. Who among us hasn't tried to sound holy and accidentally sounded a little steamy? You step closer to the carved pelican again, its beak pressed tenderly to its chest. In medieval symbolism, the pelican wounded itself to feed its young, an emblem of Christ's self-sacrifice. But tonight, it feels like a symbol of something else, devotion that bleeds a little. Love that costs. Just outside the refectory, a breeze stirs. Maybe one of the sisters left a shutter ajar. Maybe not. But you feel it, a flutter of something unspeakable. And it makes you wonder, if you'd lived then, would you have written it down? That ache? That wish? Or would you have slipped it into a poem, sealed in metaphor, and prayed no one asked too many questions? You're following faint footprints now, figurative, of course, pressed gently into the parchment trail of history. Down the hallway, into a small scriptorium with narrow windows and a constant chill. Inside, a writing desk sits beneath the flickering shadow of a candle stub. Inkpots? Quills. A vellum sheet that's not quite blank. This is where the words happened. You settle onto the low wooden stool, careful not to bump the desk. The surface is worn smooth by decades of elbows and whispered secrets. You imagine the nun who once sat here, bent over her page, lips moving silently, candlelight catching on the downy curve of her cheek. The convent bell has long since told Compline, but she's still awake, because the lines in her head won't let her sleep. This isn't just where prayers were copied or saints' lives transcribed. It's also where some nuns composed original verse, yes, even the private, intimate kind. Erotic poetry in Latin or vernacular dialects. Not necessarily explicit, but unmistakably feelingful. And always layered, cloaked in metaphor, dressed in theological drag. Take, for example, the works of Herrat of Landsberg. In the 12th century, she compiled a manuscript called the Hortus Deliciarum, the Garden of Delights. And while it's mostly didactic and philosophical, its very existence says something about what women were allowed to create. Hidden in those margins were women reclaiming the power to write beauty, sometimes with urgency, sometimes with fire. Historians still argue whether these texts should be read as expressions of sexual desire, or simply poetic conventions of the time. But the metaphors don't lie. Wounded hearts, piercing light, ravishing presence. It's all there: passion, yearning, surrender. Only the object of desire wears a crown of thorns. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit for your late-night consideration. One German nun in the 14th century allegedly wrote a poem in which she describes her soul and Christ dancing together in a meadow while he kisses her forehead. When the devil interrupts, she pulls a hairpin from her veil and stabs him in the eye. That's not metaphor. That's performance art. In a world where female bodies were either saints or temptresses, Madonnas or Eves, nuns carved out a third space, scribbled in ink, beloveds of God. And if that love burned too bright for the official canon? Well, that's why we have footnotes and commentary and long, midnight debates in university lecture halls. But the convent scriptorium was never just about religion. It was also about preservation, translation, conversation. Nuns were among the few literate women in the medieval world, and they knew it. They copied psalms and legal texts and ancient Greek philosophy. They wrote letters to bishops. They kept records. They read each other's work. You could argue they were the first literary critics, only with more candles and colder feet. And what they didn't copy is just as telling. Some of the racier poems appear only in single copies, tucked into private prayer books or bound with medical recipes. Accidental? Doubtful. These texts were cherished, memorized, maybe even whispered during embroidery, hands busy, minds far away. Picture it: 2 nuns in the herb garden, gathering lavender. One leans over and murmurs a line of verse, something about divine intoxication. The other laughs softly, a finger to her lips. Not because it's wicked, but because it's theirs. This language, this freedom, this tiny, trembling rebellion in verse. And it wasn't just Latin. Some wrote in the vernacular: Old French, Middle High German, Anglo-Norman. Languages that felt more like home. Languages that let them speak to the divine in their own voices, not just borrowed ones. One English mystic, Julian of Norwich, wrote of Jesus as a mother, nourishing, birthing, enfolding. The metaphor was shocking for the time, but beautifully grounded in lived, bodily experience. For Julian, salvation was not cold or distant, it was warm, intimate, and fleshed. The kind of love that lets you fall asleep feeling held. Of course, not everyone approved. Some male theologians dismissed women's visions as hysteria. Some demanded censure. Others tried to edit the writing, to tidy up the metaphors, trim the excess longing. But words, once born, have a way of lingering. Especially words that were never meant to survive. You look down at the vellum page again. The candle flickers. And in that fragile golden curve of a single letter, you see it, the insistence of a voice. A woman who lived, breathed, prayed, and wrote. You start to realize that the line between sacred and sensual wasn't just blurry. It was the very space these nuns occupied. They were mystics and writers, visionaries and gardeners. Their work carried longing, yes, but also defiance, clarity, power. And you, centuries later, in your own quiet room, are still reading, still listening, still wondering how much of your own longing might be poetry in disguise. The days in the convent move with the rhythm of bells and the subtle scent of incense curling through stone corridors. You're trailing behind a novice nun now, her rosary beads clicking softly against her cincture as she carries a basket of fresh herbs harvested from the cloister garden. The cool morning air is still sharp with dew, and the sky hints at the first wash of pale blue light. This garden isn't just for beauty or herbal medicine, it's a living classroom. The plants whisper secrets of healing, and the nuns learn to read their subtle signs. Rue for protection, lavender for calm, and wormwood to ward off evil spirits. You might even catch a glimpse of the apothecary's workbench, cluttered with dried roots, tiny jars of ointments, and handwritten remedies in a looping medieval script. But here's the twist: alongside the holy water and prayers, some of these plants had less saintly reputations. Mandrake root, for example, famous for its eerie human-like shape, was thought to scream when uprooted, so loudly it could kill anyone nearby. That's the kind of thing you don't want to be reading about at bedtime. Historians still argue whether these gardens were purely medicinal or if some of the plants were used in more secretive rituals, potions for love, protection, or even mild mischief. Given the nuns' penchant for poetry and metaphor, you wouldn't be surprised if a sprig of rosemary carried coded meaning too. The novice moves slowly, careful with her basket, her russet habit catching the morning light. She pauses near a wooden bench where an older nun sits embroidering a delicate gold sun onto a patch of deep indigo fabric. The scene is peaceful, but there's an undercurrent of focus, a kind of reverent intensity you only find in people who know their daily routines are sacred, yet also quietly rebellious. You watch as the embroidery needle flashes through the cloth, the sun's rays gleaming faintly with tiny gold stitches, like a miniature celestial ceremony. Remember Louis XIV and his son King Emblem? This symbol, here in the convent, carries a different kind of power, the divine light within, a spark of spiritual fire that guides these women through long nights and longer prayers. It's easy to forget, though, that these cloistered lives weren't all serene contemplation. The cloister could be a surprisingly turbulent place. Rivalries, gossip, and the politics of rank existed alongside devotion. Some nuns jockeyed for positions of authority, prioress, cellarer, mistress of novices, while others secretly wished for the freedom of the outside world. Here's a quirky detail: some medieval convents had designated punishment cells, or choirs of silence, small rooms where nuns were sent to reflect on their misbehavior or temptations. You might imagine those cells as bleak and lonely, but some scholars think they were also spaces for intense personal reflection, maybe even secret writing or prayer. And speaking of temptations, historians still argue about the true nature of some convent disciplinary practices. Were they harsh crackdowns on real infractions or exaggerated tales meant to scare young women into obedience? Either way, the tension between strict rule and personal desire was a constant undercurrent. As the morning deepens, you hear the soft echo of chanting drifting from the chapel, a haunting mix of Latin and vernacular hymns. The nuns' voices rise and fall, weaving through the vaulted ceilings like threads of silk. Their prayers are both public and deeply private acts, a bridge between earth and heaven. But it's in the quiet moments between these rituals where the true human stories hide. When a nun slips a note to a sister, or pauses to trace a letter on a parchment with a trembling finger, or steals a glance at a visitor who's not just a messenger but a bearer of hope or secret news, you realize that despite the vows, despite the cloister walls, these women lived rich emotional lives, full of friendship, longing, fear, and courage. They wrote of saints and sinners, of divine love and earthly passion, all while tending to the herbs that heal bodies and the verses that soothe souls. You're left with the image of the novice walking back through the garden, the basket lighter now, her heart fuller with the strange, beautiful contradictions of convent life, a world where silence spoke louder than words, and poetry was both prayer and rebellion. You follow the novice nun as she slips quietly into the scriptorium, the heart of the convent's intellectual and artistic life. The room smells of old parchment, crushed pigments, and beeswax from countless candles burned down to nubs. Here, light filters softly through small, stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across rows of desks strewn with quills, inkpots, and miniature sketches. This is where the convent's hidden treasure resides, manuscripts illuminated with delicate gold leaf and vivid tempera colors, telling stories both sacred and, surprisingly, a bit scandalous. You settle in to watch a senior sister, her saffron habit a sharp contrast against the deep teal robes of her assistant, as she painstakingly paints the border of a prayer book. Tiny gilded flourishes bloom on the margins like illuminated flowers, each stroke slow and deliberate, like a whispered secret. Most people think these nuns only copied holy texts, but here's the quirky twist. Some convents produced poetry filled with coded eroticism and vivid human emotion, written by the sisters themselves. These were no dull manuscripts. They throbbed with passion and paradox, exploring spiritual longing alongside earthly desire. You might never expect such frankness from cloistered women, but these poems reveal a rich inner world where faith and feeling dance together in complex harmony. Historians still argue whether these erotic verses were genuine expressions of personal experience, or metaphors for divine love, whether the nuns were rebels pushing boundaries or simply using the language of their time to articulate intense spirituality. The debate adds a fascinating layer to the convent's silent walls. The scriptorium buzzes softly with the scratching of quills and the faint rustle of vellum, but there's an electric tension here too, a sense that every letter and image carries weight beyond the surface. The sister pauses to dip her brush into a pot of ultramarine pigment, a color as precious as gold in the medieval palette, and carefully traces a line that will become a delicate vine wrapping around a miniature portrait. On the desk nearby lies a small, leather-bound notebook, filled with sketches of impossible flowers and mythical beasts, some with strangely suggestive shapes. These doodles hint at a playful side to the nuns, a subtle rebellion hidden in art. Maybe they were ways to cope with strict lives or simply joyful expressions of creativity. You think about the painstaking process, mixing pigments from crushed minerals, grinding gold into fine powder, and applying it with the precision of a jeweler. Each manuscript was a masterpiece, created not for fame but for faith, and sometimes for secret messages meant only the initiated would understand. Outside the window, the garden's herbs glint under the sun, and the distant bells signal the next prayer hour. The sister smiles faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if she knows the power of what she's creating, a world where words and images blur boundaries, challenge norms, and reveal the hidden humanity of those behind the veil. You lean back, letting the quiet magic of the scriptorium wash over you, reminded that history is never just dates and facts. It's the stories and passions that flicker beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered like gold leaf on ancient parchment. You step out of the scriptorium and into the convent's cloister, where the air is cool and fragrant with rosemary and lavender, their sharp scents mingling with the earthy dampness of stone walls softened by moss. The sunlight filters through the arches in narrow, golden beams, creating pools of warmth on the worn flagstones beneath your feet. It's prayer time, and the nuns move silently, their saffron and russet habits rustling softly as they gather in the chapel. Inside, the dim sanctuary is a stark contrast to the bright garden. Flickering candlelight dances on the carved wooden choir stalls, illuminating faces worn yet serene. The choir begins to sing, voices rising in a haunting, ancient chant that vibrates through the vaulted ceiling like a slow, pulsing heartbeat. You feel yourself sinking into the rhythm, the steady drone easing your mind toward sleep. But here's a curious detail. Some of these chants include cryptic melodic twists, subtle shifts in tone and cadence that scholars believe were secret signals, coded prayers meant to convey forbidden ideas or hidden dissent. It's as if beneath the surface of devotion, a silent conversation unfolds, audible only to those who know where to listen. Historians still argue whether these musical secrets were intentional subversions or just accidents of oral tradition, but the mystery adds an alluring dimension to the convent's spiritual life. It reminds you that even in places of strict order, humanity's urge for expression finds a way to sneak through cracks. As the chant rises and falls, you imagine the nuns lives beyond the chapel, moments of laughter in the kitchen, stolen glances in the garden, whispered poetry in the quiet corners of the dormitory. These women weren't just pious shadows. They were full of contradictions, desires, and dreams that history often forgets. After the final amen, the nuns file out with the same gentle precision, their footsteps barely disturbing the silence. You follow them back through the cloister, feeling the cool breeze brush your face, carrying with it the faintest scent of old parchment and beeswax. You pause at the garden's edge and look back at the convent, its stone walls ancient and sturdy, its secrets deep and layered like the manuscripts you saw earlier. Here, in this world of silence and song, the medieval nuns created a hidden history, one that's only just beginning to be heard. You wake to the muted sounds of dawn, soft birdsong mixing with the distant tolling of the convent's bell. Outside, the sky is a pale wash of indigo and peach, promising another quiet day cloaked in ritual and routine. You follow the worn stone path toward the infirmary, a humble building nestled beneath the arches of climbing ivy, its windows glowing faintly in the early light. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of herbs, rosemary, sage, and something sharper, like crushed juniper berries. A few nuns moved quietly among the beds, attending to the sick with gentle hands, their russet and indigo habits folded neatly as they work. You notice the small wooden bowls filled with poultices, and the shelves lined with glass jars holding dried flowers and roots, like a medieval apothecary's treasure trove. Here, amid the soft murmurs and rustling linens, you see the practical side of convent life, where faith meets medicine in a delicate balance. Some of these women were skilled healers, drawing on ancient remedies passed down through generations. They ground herbs into powders, brewed infusions, and applied balms with care that belied their austere surroundings. But here's the curious twist. Some nuns secretly composed erotic poetry on the side, scribbling verses about desire and longing in the margins of their prayer books. It's a bizarre contrast, the sacred and the sensual coexisting in the same ink-stained pages. Historians still argue whether this was rebellion, self-expression, or just a private outlet for repressed feelings, but it paints a vivid picture of complex inner lives hidden beneath the habits. You watch as a nun gently massages a patient's temples, her face calm but thoughtful, her mind perhaps drifting to the forbidden verses she writes in secret. It's a reminder that the human heart, even in the strictest environments, is never truly silenced. Outside, the sun climbs higher, casting warm light across the courtyard where laundry hangs on ropes, fluttering like colorful flags in a slow breeze. The day unfolds, a blend of duty, devotion, and whispered secrets, each moment weaving into the rich tapestry of convent life. You step outside and breathe deeply, feeling the cool morning air fill your lungs. This place, with all its contradictions, feels alive with stories waiting to be uncovered. You follow the faint echo of chanting to the chapel, where light filters softly through stained glass, painting the stone floor in shards of ruby, sapphire, and emerald. The nuns are gathered in a tight semicircle around the altar, their voices rising and falling in unison, weaving prayers that seem to hang in the air like mist. Their habits, deep teal and saffron, create a moving mosaic of color against the austere gray stone walls. The air smells faintly of beeswax from the candles and old parchment. You notice the precise choreography of their movements, hands clasped, heads bowed, then raised at just the right moment. It's a ritual as old as the convent itself, a sacred routine that binds these women together beyond words. Their voices blend, sometimes trembling with emotion, other times steady as the heartbeat of the building. The music and the silence between notes both carry meaning. It's a refuge and a stage, a place where devotion and discipline intertwine. But beneath this solemnity lies another layer. Some of the chants, historians still argue, were adapted from earlier secular songs, secret remnants of the world these women left behind. Perhaps the melodies carried hidden messages, a coded language for desires unspoken in the open. The duality of faith and forbidden longing hums quietly beneath the surface of every note. You catch a glimpse of Sister Marguerite, her face serene but her eyes flickering with a shadow of something more, a private thought, a secret poem tucked in the folds of her habit. Her lips move subtly as if mouthing words beyond the official prayers. You wonder how many hearts in this room harbor whispered dreams and secret verses, penned in the dark hours after lights out. As the final chord fades, the nuns begin to disperse, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone. You linger a moment longer, feeling the quiet pulse of faith and hidden passion mingling in this ancient space. The chapel, like the convent itself, is a place of contrasts, where silence speaks volumes, and devotion dances with desire. You slip quietly into the scriptorium, the heart of the convent's creative and secret life, where the flicker of candlelight reveals rows of wooden desks scattered with parchment, quills, and pots of ink. The air here is thick with the scent of dried herbs and old paper, tinged faintly with something floral, maybe lavender, meant to calm restless minds. The walls are lined with shelves holding leather-bound volumes, their gilded spines catching the candlelight like whispers of forgotten stories. Sister Isabel sits at one desk, her fingers stained with ink, her brow furrowed in concentration as she composes a poem. Her habit of deep russet contrasts with the pale parchment, and you notice the delicate script she's crafting, words laced with both sacred devotion and unexpected sensuality. Historians still argue whether this kind of writing was purely personal or meant to be shared discreetly among trusted sisters, but either way, these poems reveal a hidden layer of life within these walls. Nearby, a small wooden box holds scraps of parchment covered in flourishing marginalia, tiny drawings of flowers, hands, and eyes that seem to hint at secret meanings. The subtle gilding on the edges catches the light, a reminder of the preciousness of these coded messages. You wonder how many such works were destroyed or hidden over centuries, leaving only tantalizing glimpses behind. The scriptorium feels alive with silent conversations, not just between words and ink, but between hearts brave enough to write what others dare not say aloud. Sister Isabel's lips move softly, perhaps murmuring lines that blend the sacred and the profane, each verse a quiet rebellion wrapped in reverence. As you leave, the flickering candles cast long shadows on the parchment-strewn desks, a visual echo of the dual lives these women led, devoted servants of God by day, secret poets of desire by night. The convent's day winds down as dusk settles softly, turning stained glass windows into kaleidoscopes of muted indigo and russet light. You follow the echo of footsteps along stone corridors, where the scent of beeswax mingles with faint whispers of hymnals practiced earlier. The nuns, clad in their simple habits, begin to withdraw into the quiet solitude of their cells, each a small sanctuary lined with wooden crosses, prayer books, and carefully folded linen. In the fading light, you glimpse Sister Isabel closing her journal, the final lines of her poem safely tucked inside, a secret kept beneath layers of faith and flesh. Historians still argue whether such writings were acts of defiance, spiritual exploration, or both, but their existence alone invites you to reconsider the rigid image of medieval convent life. Behind those austere walls, complexity thrived, unspoken yet vibrant. The sounds soften, a distant owl's call, the faint rustle of silk slippers on stone, and the soft closing of heavy wooden doors. Outside, the garden's lavender and rosemary seem to exhale into the cool night air, a quiet reminder of the world beyond cloistered walls. You feel the weight of centuries pressing gently around you, the intertwining of silence and song, duty and desire, carved into every stone and scroll. As your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the candle flames guttering low, shadows stretching long and slow across the vellum pages. The poems, prayers, and whispered dreams settle into a hush, inviting your mind to drift into the same mysterious, delicate space where these medieval nuns lived their dual lives, devout yet daring, hidden yet eternal. Now take a slow breath, and let this quiet world lull you gently toward sleep.